Girls go crazy when they see a beautiful horse. The reason leaves its owner in shock. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Kentucky Derby training grounds as Ethan Matthews adjusted Duke's saddle for what felt like the 100th time. His prized stallion, a magnificent bay thoroughbred with a distinguished white star on his forehead, stood majestically in the morning light. 3 consecutive victories in major races had made them the favorites for today's championship, and Ethan could almost taste the triumph. "Easy there, boy," Ethan murmured, running his hand along Duke's muscular neck. The horse's coat gleamed like polished mahogany, a testament to the countless hours of grooming and care. At 28, Ethan had already made a name for himself in the racing circuit, but Duke was special. He wasn't just another horse, he was his ticket to legendary status. The grandstands were filling rapidly, the excited chatter of the crowd growing louder with each passing minute. Ethan's trainer, Marcus, approached with the final race briefing. "Course conditions are perfect," he said, checking his clipboard. "The competition's strong, but nothing Duke hasn't handled before." Ethan nodded, his confidence unwavering. He'd studied every competitor, memorized every racing strategy, and Duke was in peak condition. Nothing could possibly go wrong, or so he thought. The first sign that this wouldn't be an ordinary race day came when Duke's ears suddenly pricked forward, his attention drawn to something in the distance. Ethan followed his horse's gaze to a group of young women near the practice track's fence. There were 5 of them, all in their early 20s, and they were watching Duke with an intensity that seemed odd for typical race fans. "Look at him," one of them exclaimed, her voice carrying across the morning air. "It's really him." Duke's reaction was immediate and unprecedented. The usually composed stallion shifted his weight, his nostrils flaring as he took in their scent. Ethan had never seen him so focused on spectators before. "Duke, focus," Ethan commanded. But for the first time in their partnership, the horse seemed to resist his guidance. The women were now pressing against the fence, their excitement palpable. One of them, a petite blonde with striking green eyes, held something in her hand that caught the sunlight, a small pendant that looked like a horse. Marcus stepped closer, concern etching his features. "Ethan, maybe we should move him to the holding area early." But before either man could act, Duke took several determined steps toward the fence, dragging Ethan with him. The women's excitement grew, and they began calling out to the horse in a way that suggested familiarity. "He remembers," the blonde woman cried out, tears streaming down her face. "Grandpa always said he would." Ethan's world tilted on its axis as Duke, his perfectly trained championship horse, gently pulled free from his grip and walked purposefully toward the group of strangers. The security guards moved to intervene. But something in the scene made them hesitate. There was no panic, no chaos, just an inexplicable reunion unfolding before hundreds of bewildered onlookers. As Duke reached the fence, the blonde woman held up her pendant, and the horse stretched his neck forward, touching his nose to it with surprising gentleness. The other women were crying now too, reaching out to stroke his face with trembling hands. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. In 3 years of working with Duke, he'd never seen anything like this. The championship race, his carefully laid plans, his assured victory, all of it seemed to fade into the background as he watched his horse connect with these strangers in a way that defied explanation. Little did he know, this moment would mark the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, legacy, and the true meaning of victory. As he approached the fence, the blonde woman turned to him with eyes full of recognition, though they'd never met. "Mr. Matthews," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "There's something you need to know about Duke, something my grandfather never got to tell anyone." The morning breeze carried the weight of unspoken histories as Ethan realized that the race he'd been preparing for was about to become the least important event of the day. The pre-race preparation area had become an impromptu meeting ground. Ethan, still struggling to process the situation, found himself sitting on a hay bale across from the 5 women, with Duke standing protectively near them. Marcus hovered nearby, checking his watch nervously. They had less than 2 hours until race time. "My name is Sarah Collins," the blonde woman began, her hand still clutching the horse-shaped pendant. "These are my cousins, Emma, Rachel, Lucy, And Grace. We're all granddaughters of William Collins. The name hit Ethan like a thunderbolt. William Collins was a legend in horse breeding circles, known for his almost mystical ability to raise champions. He'd passed away 3 years ago, right around the time Ethan had purchased Duke from an anonymous seller through his agent. Duke's real name, Sarah continued, her voice soft with emotion, is Morning Whisper. The horse's ears twitched at the mention of the name, and he nickered softly. Ethan watched in amazement as Duke, or Morning Whisper, moved closer to Sarah, resting his head gently against her shoulder. Grandpa raised him from birth. Emma, the tallest of the cousins, explained. He was different from the other horses. Special. We all grew up with him, spending every summer at the ranch. He wasn't just a horse to us, he was family. Rachel, who had been quietly wiping tears, opened her phone and showed Ethan a photograph. It showed a younger Duke, surrounded by 5 little girls in pigtails and summer dresses, all beaming at the camera. Behind them stood an elderly man with kind eyes and weather-worn features, William Collins himself. But how did he end up at auction? Ethan asked, his voice hoarse with confusion. Why would William Collins sell such a special horse? The cousins exchanged glances heavy with unspoken pain. Lucy, the youngest, spoke up. He didn't. Grandpa would never have sold Morning Whisper. When he got sick, everything happened so fast. There was confusion about the estate, and somehow Morning Whisper disappeared from the ranch. We've been searching for him ever since. Grace, who had been silent until now, added, We saw him in a racing magazine last month. We couldn't believe it at first. But that star on his forehead, we'd know it anywhere. We had to come see for ourselves. Ethan's mind raced. He'd paid a premium price for Duke through one of the most reputable agencies in Kentucky. The paperwork had been immaculate, yet here was evidence of a history he'd known nothing about, a story that made his chest tight with implications. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out an old leather-bound journal. This was Grandpa's training diary. The last entry... She paused, her voice catching. The last entry was about Morning Whisper. There's something in here you need to see, Mr. Matthews. Something that could change everything. Before she could open the journal, Marcus interrupted. Ethan, we need to start final preparations. The race. Ethan looked at his watch. Then at Duke, Morning Whisper, who seemed more alive, more present than he'd ever seen him. The horse that had won him 3 major races had a past, a family, and possibly secrets that could reshape their future. The race can wait, Ethan said firmly, surprising himself. This is more important. Sarah opened the journal with trembling hands, but before she could read from it, a commotion near the track entrance drew everyone's attention. A sleek black car had pulled up, and from it emerged Charles Wellington III, owner of Wellington Racing Enterprises, and the man who had sold Duke to Ethan through his agency. Wellington's face, usually composed and confident, turned ashen as he spotted the group gathered around the horse. His reaction told Ethan everything he needed to know. There was more to this story than a simple sale, and Wellington knew exactly what it was. The morning sun climbed higher in the Kentucky sky as the truth prepared to break through years of carefully constructed facades. Duke, or Morning Whisper, stood tall among his long-lost family, while Ethan realized that the real race today wouldn't be on the track, but toward a truth that had been hidden for far too long. Charles Wellington's arrival created a ripple of tension across the preparation area. His usual polished demeanor cracked as he strode toward the group, his Italian leather shoes kicking up dust from the track. "Ethan, my boy," Wellington called out, his forced smile not reaching his eyes. "There seems to be some confusion here. Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Mr. Wellington," Sarah interrupted, standing up with the journal clutched to her chest. Or should I say, Grandpa's former business partner. The older man's facade crumbled further. Duke, Morning Whisper, stomped his hoof. Ears pinned back as Wellington approached, causing the businessman to halt his advance. "Sarah Collins," Wellington acknowledged, straightening his tie. "You've grown since I last saw you at your grandfather's ranch." Emma stepped forward, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "We know what you did, Mr. Wellington. It's all in Grandpa's journal, including the real reason you visited him the day before he went into the hospital." Ethan watched the exchange, pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. Mr. Wellington, what's going on here? Sarah opened the journal to a marked page and began to read. March 15th, 2021. Charles came today, offering to buy Morning Whisper again. Says he has proof the horse carries the bloodline he's been searching for, but Morning Whisper isn't for sale. He's more than just genetics. He's got something special, something you can't breed for. The girls love him. And I promised them he'd always be part of our family. Besides, there's something about him that could change everything we know about horse training. Wellington's face reddened. That's enough. William was old, confused. His notes don't mean anything. Then how do you explain this? Rachel pulled out another document from her bag, a medical report. Grandpa was admitted to the hospital the day after your visit. The doctors found unusual levels of sedatives in his system. The same day he was admitted, Morning Whisper disappeared from the ranch. The revelation hung in the air like summer lightning. Ethan felt his world tilting again as he turned to Wellington, the man who had sold him Duke for an astronomical sum 3 years ago. You drugged William Collins and stole his horse. Ethan's voice was barely controlled. Stolen property, Wellington scoffed. But his confidence was clearly shaken. I have all the proper documentation of sale. Forged documentation, Lucy interjected, pulling out more papers from her bag. We found Grandpa's original ownership papers. The signatures on your documents don't match. We've had them analyzed. Marcus, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. That's why you insisted the sale be handled through 3 different shell companies. You were hiding the trail. Wellington's composure finally broke. You don't understand, that horse carries the most valuable bloodline in racing history. William was a fool to keep him as a pet. Look at what Ethan has accomplished with him. 3 major victories. 4, Sarah corrected, opening the journal to another page. Morning Whisper won his first race at our ranch, with me on his back. Grandpa's last entry explains why he's so special. Why Wellington was so desperate to own him. She turned to Ethan, her green eyes intense. Mr. Matthews, what you've achieved with Morning Whisper is incredible, but you've only scratched the surface. There's something about him that Grandpa discovered, something that could revolutionize horse racing forever. But it's not about genetics or breeding, it's about connection, about family. As if to emphasize her point, Duke Morning Whisper moved to stand between Sarah and Wellington, his protective stance clear to everyone present. The horse that had won millions in prizes, that had made Ethan famous, was showing his true colors, not just as a champion racer, but as a beloved family member with an extraordinary secret. Wellington reached into his jacket, likely for his phone, but Grace stepped forward. We've already contacted the Racing Commission. They're on their way. All we want is justice for Grandpa and Morning Whisper. Ethan looked at his watch again. 1 hour until race time, and everything he thought he knew about his prized horse had been turned upside down. But as he watched Duke nuzzle Sarah's shoulder while she held her grandfather's journal, he realized that some victories weren't measured in finish lines and trophies. The real question was, what was William Collins's discovery about Morning Whisper, and how would it change not just this race, but the entire world of horse racing? As the Racing Commission officials arrived, Sarah led Ethan away from the growing commotion, with Duke, Morning Whisper following closely behind. They walked to a quiet corner of the stables, where the morning sun streamed through high windows, creating patterns on the hay-strewn floor. There's something you need to understand about Morning Whisper, Sarah said, opening her grandfather's journal to its final pages. Grandpa discovered it during the meteor shower of 2020. Ethan leaned against a stable post, his mind still reeling from the morning's revelations. What happened that night? Sarah's fingers traced the weathered pages as she read, Tonight, something extraordinary happened. The girls were watching the meteor shower with Morning Whisper in the paddock. As the lights streaked across the sky, he started behaving differently. The meteors reflected in his eyes, and suddenly, he began to move in perfect synchronization with each girl's emotions. When Lucy was scared of the thunder, he calmed. When Emma was excited about a shooting star, he pranced. It wasn't just normal horse behavior. He was connecting with them on a deeper level. Duke's ears pricked forward as Sarah read, his intelligent eyes fixed on her. "My grandpa spent months studying him after that," Emma added, joining them with the other cousins. "He discovered that Morning Whisper has an extraordinary ability to form emotional bonds with humans, It's not just basic horse empathy, it's something more profound. Rachel pulled out a series of photographs from her bag. They showed Duke Morning Whisper performing incredible feats, moving in perfect harmony with riders he'd just met, responding to unspoken commands, even seeming to predict when someone was in distress. That's why he's such an incredible racer, Grace explained. He doesn't just run for victory, he runs in harmony with his rider's spirit, but it only works when there's a true emotional connection. Ethan thought back to his races with Duke. They'd won spectacularly, yes, but there had always been moments when the horse seemed to hold back, as if waiting for something more from him. Wellington knew about this ability, Lucy continued. He wanted to study Morning Whisper, replicate whatever makes him special. But Grandpa knew it wasn't something that could be manufactured or bred. It was about love, family, and trust. Sarah turned to the journal's final entry. Morning Whisper isn't just a horse. He's a bridge between hearts. In the right hands, he could revolutionize not just racing, but our entire understanding of the connection between humans and horses. But this gift must be protected, nurtured through love, not exploited for profit. As if responding to his old name in the journal, Duke Morning Whisper stepped forward and gently touched his nose to the pages. In that moment, Ethan felt something shift in his understanding of his relationship with the horse. All those times he'd pushed for faster times, focused solely on winning, he'd been missing the true magic that made his partner special. The race starts in 45 minutes, Marcus called from the stable entrance. The commission wants to speak with everyone, but they're not pulling Duke from the race. The paperwork will take days to process. Ethan looked at Sarah, then at Duke Morning Whisper. What would your grandfather want? Sarah smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. He'd want Morning Whisper to run, but not for glory or profit. He'd want him to run for joy, for the pure love of it. A plan began forming in Ethan's mind. What if we could prove your grandfather's discovery to the world, not through tests or studies, but through something more powerful? The cousins gathered closer as Ethan outlined his idea. It was risky, unprecedented, and might cost him the victory he'd been dreaming of, but it could also change everything. In the distance, the crowd was growing larger, unaware that they were about to witness not just a race, but a demonstration of something that transcended ordinary competition. As Wellington was led away by racing officials, Ethan realized that the true finish line today wouldn't be marked by a post or a ribbon, but by the revelation of a truth that had been hidden in plain sight all along. The pre-race atmosphere crackled with tension as Ethan prepared Duke Morning Whisper for the most important race of their lives. But this time, everything was different. Instead of their usual meticulous routine, Sarah and her cousins helped with the preparations, each touch and gesture carrying years of loving memories. The other riders are watching us, Marcus muttered, glancing at the competition. Indeed, the unusual scene had drawn attention, 5 young women fussing over the favorite to win, while Ethan Matthews, normally intensely focused before a race, stood back with an unfamiliar look of serenity on his face. Let them watch, Ethan replied. They're about to see something unprecedented. Sarah approached with the horse pendant, now hanging from a longer chain. Grandpa wore this during every race he ever supervised, she said, holding it out to Ethan. It's time it returned to the track. As Ethan slipped the pendant around his neck, Duke Morning Whisper's eyes followed the familiar trinket, and something magical happened. The horse's entire demeanor shifted, his bearing becoming both regal and relaxed, as if 2 parts of his identity, the champion racer and the beloved family companion, had finally merged. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer's voice boomed across the track, please take your seats. The Kentucky Classic will begin in 15 minutes. Emma stepped forward with the journal. There's one last thing you need to know, she said, opening to a page marked with a pressed flower. Grandpa discovered that Morning Whisper runs his best when... She was interrupted by racing officials approaching their group. Mr. Matthews, it's time. We need all non-essential personnel to clear the area. Ethan quickly memorized the page Emma showed him, his eyes widening at the revelation. The cousins hugged Duke Morning Whisper one last time before being escorted to their seats, special box seats that Ethan had arranged for them at the last minute. As Ethan mounted, he felt different. The familiar pre-race jitters were replaced by a profound sense of connection. Duke Morning Whisper stood perfectly still, but Ethan could feel an energy coursing through him that he'd never experienced before. "Riders, to your positions!" The other horses pranced and fidgeted as they lined up, but Duke Morning Whisper remained calm, his ears swiveling between Ethan and the section where Sarah and her cousins sat. The pendant rested against Ethan's chest, warm, despite the cool morning air. "Ethan," Marcus said from beside the gate, "whatever you're planning, make it count." The starting gates closed around them. Ethan leaned forward, his lips close to Duke's ear. "Let's show them what family can do," and he whispered. The bell rang, the gates flew open, and everything changed. From the first stride, it was clear this wasn't going to be a normal race. Duke Morning Whisper moved with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. Instead of fighting for the lead, he settled into a rhythm that seemed to flow from somewhere deeper than training or instinct. As they rounded the first turn, Ethan did something that made the crowd gasp. Instead of maintaining his competitive position, he guided Duke Morning Whisper to the outside of the pack, giving them a clear view of the grandstand. The horse's stride never faltered, but his head turned slightly, acknowledging the 5 women who were now standing, their hands clasped together. "Matthews is throwing the race," someone shouted, but they couldn't have been more wrong. What happened next would be talked about in racing circles for years to come. Duke Morning Whisper began to run in a way that defied conventional racing wisdom. His gait transformed into something that looked more like a dance than a race, each stride perfectly synchronized with Ethan's heartbeat. The pendant bounced against Ethan's chest, catching the sunlight with each stride. The other horses and their riders began to fade away as Duke Morning Whisper created his own rhythm on the track. It wasn't about speed anymore, it was about harmony. About showing the world what William Collins had discovered that night under the meteor shower. As they approached the final turn, Ethan remembered Emma's last words from the journal. With tears in his eyes and a smile on his face, he did the one thing no professional jockey would ever do in the middle of a championship race. As Duke Morning Whisper thundered down the final stretch, Ethan did the unthinkable. He loosened his grip on the reins, leaned back in the saddle, and began to sing. It wasn't a song anyone in the stands would recognize. It was an old lullaby, one that Sarah and her cousins had hummed to Morning Whisper on countless starry nights at their grandfather's ranch. Ethan's voice, carrying notes of both joy and sorrow, floated across the track. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. Duke Morning Whisper's ears swiveled back, catching the melody. His stride, already a thing of beauty, transformed into something otherworldly. Each hoofbeat became a note in a grand symphony, perfectly in tune with Ethan's song and the pounding hearts of the 5 women in the stands. The crowd fell silent, sensing they were witnessing something beyond the realm of ordinary sport. Even the announcer's voice faltered, unable to describe the scene unfolding before them. As they passed the grandstand, Sarah and her cousins joined in the song, their voices carrying across the hushed arena. Duke Morning Whisper's eyes, usually focused straight ahead during a race, turned to them, reflecting a depth of emotion rarely seen in any animal. The other horses and riders, caught up in the moment, began to fall into a similar rhythm. It was as if Duke Morning Whisper's gift was expanding, touching everyone on the track. Jockeys who had been fiercely competing moments before now found themselves part of a greater whole, their horses moving in harmony with the beating heart of the race itself. Spectators began to rise, many with tears in their eyes, as they felt the waves of emotion emanating from the track. It wasn't just a horse race anymore, it was a demonstration of the profound connection possible between humans and animals. A living testament to William Collins' incredible discovery. As they approached the finish line, Duke Morning Whisper was clearly in the lead, but winning seemed almost irrelevant now. Ethan's song grew stronger, filled with all the love, trust, and joy he had discovered in this extraordinary journey. With one final, soaring note, Duke Morning Whisper crossed the finish line. But he didn't stop. Instead, he gracefully curved around, trotting back towards the still-singing cousins in the stands. The other horses followed, as if drawn by an invisible thread, creating a circle of unity where competition had once reigned. Ethan slid from the saddle, his legs shaky, not from exertion, but from the sheer emotional power of what had just transpired. He buried his face in Duke Morning Whisper's mane as Sarah and her cousins rushed onto the track, enveloping both man and horse in a group embrace. The silence that had fallen over the racetrack slowly gave way to a rising tide of applause. It began softly, then grew into a thunderous standing ovation. People were hugging strangers, wiping away tears, all moved by the display of connection and harmony they had just witnessed. Racing officials, journalists, and other riders began to converge on the group, all clamoring for explanations. But Ethan, Sarah, and the cousins remained in their circle with Duke Morning Whisper, the outside world fading away as they basked in the glow of a moment that had changed everything. Marcus pushed through the crowd, his face a mix of awe and disbelief. "Ethan," he said, his voice cracking, "what just happened out there?" Ethan looked up, his eyes shining. "We didn't just win a race, Marcus. We showed the world what's possible when you run with your heart." As cameras flashed and questions flew, Duke Morning Whisper stood calmly at the center of the storm, his eyes reflecting a wisdom and contentment that seemed to transcend his equine nature. The pendant around Ethan's neck glinted in the sunlight, a symbol of the legacy that had finally come full circle. In that moment, they all knew that the world of horse racing, and perhaps the relationship between humans and animals, would never be the same again. The true race, the one that mattered most, had been won the moment Ethan had chosen connection over competition, love over victory. And as reporters began to ask about the unorthodox race strategy, the unusual presence of the 5 women, and the mysterious song that had captivated an entire stadium, Ethan realized that their journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. In the days following the Kentucky Classic, the world of horse racing found itself in an unprecedented state of upheaval. The footage of Duke Morning Whisper's performance went viral, captivating millions far beyond the usual racing audience. Sports analysts, animal behaviorists, and even neuroscientists clamored to understand and explain what had transpired on that fateful day. Ethan, Sarah, and her cousins found themselves at the center of a media storm. They had retreated to William Collins' old ranch, seeking refuge from the constant barrage of questions and interview requests. Duke Morning Whisper grazed contentedly in the fields where he had spent his early years, seemingly unaware of the global sensation he had become. On a warm evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the group gathered on the ranch's wide porch. The air was filled with the scent of grass and the gentle melody of wind chimes. "I've been going through Grandpa's old files," Emma said, spreading papers across the porch table. His research goes far beyond just Morning Whisper. He believed this ability to connect emotionally could be awakened in other horses, maybe even other animals. Lucy, who had been quietly observing Duke Morning Whisper in the field, added, "It's not just about racing. Think about therapy animals, search and rescue, even companionship for the elderly or disabled. The possibilities are endless." Ethan nodded, his fingers absently tracing the outline of the pendant he now wore constantly. "But it has to be done right. We can't let this become another way to exploit animals for profit." Sarah, who had been on the phone with yet another journalist, hung up with a sigh. "The Racing Commission is in chaos. Half of them want to disqualify us for unsportsmanlike conduct, while the other half are hailing us as revolutionaries." Rachel laughed, a sound tinged with both amusement and disbelief. Unsportsmanlike conduct, as if showing the world the true spirit of partnership between human and horse could ever be unsportsmanlike. Marcus, who had driven up from the city to join them, cleared his throat. "It's not just the commission. I've been fielding calls from other trainers, owners, even animal rights groups. Everyone wants to know how to replicate what you did." Ethan stood up, walking to the porch railing. In the fading light, he could see Duke Morning Whisper trotting towards them, drawn by some unseen connection. "We can't replicate it," he said softly. "At least, not in the way they're thinking. This isn't about technique or training methods. It's about love," Grace finished for him, "pure and simple. Grandpa knew it, and now we have to help the world understand it." As Duke Morning Whisper approached, each of them felt that familiar wave of emotion, a mixture of joy, peace, and something deeper that defied easy description. It was the feeling that had captivated an entire stadium, and now held the power to transform the way humans and animals interacted. "So what do we do now?" Marcus asked, voicing the question that had been on everyone's mind. Sarah stood up, her eyes shining with determination. "We honor Grandpa's legacy. We take what we've learned from Morning Whisper and use it to make a real difference." Ethan turned from the railing, his expression thoughtful. "We start an institute," he said, the idea crystallizing as he spoke. "The Collins Institute for Interspecies Emotional Intelligence. We bring together researchers, trainers, animal behaviorists, anyone who wants to explore this connection the right way." The idea hung in the air, filled with potential. Duke Morning Whisper nickered softly, as if giving his approval. "It won't be easy," Marcus cautioned. "You'll face skepticism, opposition from those who profit from the current system." "When has anything worthwhile ever been easy?" Emma countered, her voice filled with the same determination that had brought them to the Kentucky Classic against all odds. As the last light faded from the sky and stars began to twinkle overhead, the group fell into a comfortable silence. Each of them could feel the weight of the task ahead, but also the incredible potential for change. They had stumbled upon something profound, something that could reshape not just the world of horse racing, but the very nature of human-animal relationships. Duke Morning Whisper rested his head on the porch railing, his eyes reflecting the starlight. In that moment, they all understood that their journey had only just begun. The race they had won was merely the starting gate for a much greater adventure, one that would challenge perceptions, open hearts, and perhaps, in some small way, help heal the rift between humanity and the natural world. As the night deepened, plans were made, ideas were shared, and a vision for the future began to take shape. The Collins Institute would become a beacon of hope, a place where the extraordinary connection they had discovered could be nurtured and shared with the world. Little did they know, their story was about to take one final, unexpected turn. 6 months after the race that changed everything, the Collins Institute for Interspecies Emotional Intelligence was no longer just a dream. Thanks to Ethan's connections in the racing world and the viral fame of Duke Morning Whisper's performance, they had secured funding and support from unexpected quarters. The old Collins Ranch had been transformed, with new research facilities seamlessly integrated into the pastoral landscape. On a crisp autumn morning, Ethan stood at the entrance of the institute, greeting the first group of students and researchers. Sarah and her cousins were by his side, each wearing a small pendant similar to the one Ethan never took off, a symbol of their shared mission. As the eager group filed in, Ethan noticed an elderly man hanging back, leaning on a cane and watching the proceedings with keen interest. There was something familiar about him, but Ethan couldn't quite place it. Sarah noticed Ethan's distraction. "Everything okay?" Before Ethan could respond, Duke Morning Whisper, who had been quietly grazing nearby, suddenly lifted his head and trotted over to the old man. The horse nickered softly, gently nuzzling the stranger's shoulder. Ethan and Sarah exchanged glances and approached. As they got closer, Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "It can't be," she whispered. The old man looked up, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of mischief and wisdom. "Hello, Sarah," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "It's been a while. Grandpa." Sarah's voice was barely audible, thick with emotion. William Collins smiled, patting Duke Morning Whisper's neck. "I always said this old boy had a way of bringing family together." The next few moments were a blur of tears, hugs and exclamations of disbelief. The other cousins rushed over, alerted by Sarah's cry. As the initial shock wore off, they all moved to a quiet corner of the grounds where William could sit and explain. "But how?" Ethan asked, still struggling to process the appearance of the man whose journal had changed everything. "We thought," William nodded, understanding the unspoken question. "After my accident, I woke up in the hospital with no memory of who I was. By the time I started remembering, months had passed. I was in a care facility in another state, listed as a John Doe." He looked at his granddaughters, his eyes filled with regret and love. I'm so sorry for what you all went through. By the time I was well enough to come home, I learned that Morning Whisper was gone and the ranch had been sold. I wasn't sure if I had a home to come back to. Emma, always the practical one, asked, "But why didn't you contact us once you saw the news about the race?" William's weathered face creased in a smile. "I wanted to. Believe me, but when I saw what you all had accomplished, the institute you were building, I needed to be sure I wouldn't be interfering with something beautiful. So I watched, and I waited, and I knew the right moment would come." Ethan listened, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Part of him wanted to be angry at the pain this man's disappearance had caused, but looking at the joy on Sarah's face and feeling Duke Morning Whisper's contentment, he knew anger had no place here. "Mr. Collins," Ethan said, extending his hand, "your work, your legacy, it's changing the world. We've only just begun to understand what you discovered." William took Ethan's hand, but instead of shaking it, he placed something in his palm. It was a small, worn key. "There's a locked drawer in my old study," he said. "What you've seen in my journal is just the beginning. The real work, the deeper understanding, now it's all there." Sarah, who had been clinging to her grandfather's arm, looked up in awe. "You mean there's more?" William nodded, his eyes bright with the excitement of a born researcher. "So much more. What Morning Whisper can do. It's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole world of connection out there, waiting to be explored." As the implications of this sank in, Duke Morning Whisper let out a soft whinny, drawing everyone's attention. The horse stood there, his bearing regal yet welcoming, embodying the bridge between human understanding and animal wisdom. Ethan looked around at the group, the Collins family reunited, the institute coming to life around them, and the horse that had brought them all together. He realized that this wasn't an ending, but a new beginning. The race that had started on that fateful day at the Kentucky Classic was far from over. In fact, they were all poised at a new starting gate, ready to embark on the greatest adventure of their lives. "Well," Ethan said, a smile spreading across his face, "I guess we'd better get to work. We have a world to change." As they walked together towards the old study, with Duke Morning Whisper following close behind, there was a palpable sense of excitement and possibility in the air. The future stretched out before them, filled with the promise of deeper connections, greater understanding us, and the enduring power of love between humans, animals, and the world around them. And somewhere, in the gentle breeze that ruffled Duke Morning Whisper's mane, in the laughter of reunited family, and in the shared purpose that bound them all together, the spirit of what William Collins had discovered lived on, ready to touch hearts and open minds for generations to come,